Hi, and welcome to The Working Songwriter, the show where today's best songwriters come to talk shop. I'm your host, Joe Pug. Each episode here we host a distinguished guest, and we ask them to go deep on their inspiration, on their process, on the general ups and downs of making a life in music. So, whether you're a grizzled veteran, teaching beatboxing classes at the local school of rock, or else a scrappy upstart, taking a YouTube tutorial on beat sequencing, this is your show, because ultimately it is what every writer seeks most, an ironclad excuse to put off actually writing. Hey everybody, it's the last Friday of April 2022, and I thank you for joining us. This week's show is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. I'm old enough to remember when you had to pay somebody called a web developer to get a website made, and it would always be some guy named Lil Mark who drove a 1994 Buick Century with a custom Eddie Bauer interior, and who is always trying to sell you quote-unquote designer drugs, but which were really just Goody's headache powder. And Lil Mark would charge you about $1,000 for a website that would be obsolete in 6 months. But it's the future now, you guys. That's not how it works anymore. We're allowed to have nice things now. One of those nice things is Bandzoogle. Bandzoogle powers the websites of tens of thousands of musicians around the world, from weekend warriors to Grammy winners. All the features you need for a professional website are already built in: hosting and a custom domain name, dozens of fully customizable design templates, tools to sell your music, and merch commission-free. Listeners to the Working Songwriter podcast can go to bandzoogle.com and try it for free for 30 days. Use the promo code TWS to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. If you'd like to hear some of my music live in the coming weeks, the first Sunday of every month at 9 p.m. Eastern, I'm over on YouTube for Sunday Songs. That's a live stream. I'm live. I'm playing tunes, I'm taking questions in the live chat, I'm taking requests in the live chat. It's a really fun, really interactive experience. I dare to say that we're building something of a little community over there, including many people who are listeners of this podcast. So come on over and be a part of it. That's the first Sunday night of every month at 9 p.m. Eastern over on YouTube. Head on over to joepugmusic.com and click on the live stream tab. Finally, if you enjoyed this podcast, if you'd like to help it remain a viable endeavor for me, here's a couple things that you could do to help. First, you could become a supporter of the show over at Patreon. Patreon is a platform that allows you to directly support creative endeavors that you find meaningful. You just head to their site, Patreon. You search for The Working Songwriter, or you search for my name, and then you sign up to kick in a few bucks every month for the show. Think of it as a voluntary subscription, a subscription that you certainly don't have to pay for, but that you choose to pay for because you dig the show and because you won't miss a few bucks at the end of the month. If just 1% of our listenership would kick in the price of a cup of coffee every month, it would make an immense difference. So thank you to everybody who has taken the time and the capital to support the show in that way. And if you're not in a place where you can help the show in that way, there's still two ways that you could help us out for free. First, you could leave us a rating in the iTunes store, or second, you could simply tell a friend about the show. Spread the word about the show. The simple math on those two things is that they will help me much more than they will be a pain in the ass for you. Okay, I'll end all the harassment there. You might have noticed that there was not a show last week, and I apologize for that. The computer that I record and edit the show with was mysteriously out of order when I returned home from a tour. And I'm not going to throw my 3-year-old daughter under the bus for that, because I still have no evidence as to who was the culprit, but I still do have some strong suspicions, and the investigation is still open and ongoing. So I'll update you on that as it goes forward. As you can hear now, as I'm talking to you, the computer is now back in working order. And thank God for that, and I hope you enjoy this week's conversation. Our guest this week is the creative force behind a band whose signature song has gone many times platinum and which has been covered by whole different generations of fellow artists. Brendan Brown is the lead singer and songwriter behind the New York-based rock band Wheatus. He got his start commuting in from Long Island to the bustling Manhattan club scene of the late 1990s and early 2000s. The cult following that he built with his band in the city led to a major label record deal and the release of his self-produced debut record. The song Teenage Dirtbag became a smash that has sold many millions of copies and has continued to have a long life as younger artists such as One Direction cover the song. Wheatus has continued to tour and record, now 3 decades into their wonderful run. Rolling Stone has said that Teenage Dirtbag is an anthem of teenage alienation that has grown into an enduring cult classic. I got a chance to catch up with Brendan on the phone this week to hear about his musical journey so far. Brendan Brown of Wheatus, thanks so much for being a part of the Working Songwriter podcast. You grew up in New York, just a bit outside of the city. What did music look like in your household growing up?
Well, my grandmother lived with us growing up. Her husband had gotten very ill and was in long-term hospital care, and so she lived with us from as far back as I can remember. And she was singing, all the time, show tunes and The Sound of Music and some classic rag stuff from when she was a teenager. And then it was my mother was heavy into Motown. My father was into a lot of rock and soul, Sly, and Led Zeppelin, and stuff like that. So, and they were all into songwriters. They were all into Paul Simon and Prince and Otis Redding and Bob Dylan and Bob Marley was on all the time, and Linda Ronstadt and Willie Nelson. Big time Willie Nelson.
Wow, that's a real spread, especially in the pre-Spotify world, to have that much going on at your house at that time.
It was all over the place. I distinctly remember being maybe about 5 years old, and I had learned by watching how to load and start the reel-to-reel. We had Rumors on reel-to-reel, and a couple of Beatles records on reel-to-reel, and I'm lucky that my first exposure to these recordings was in sort of the purest analog form. And when you're 4 years old, you're standing in front of the big Radio Shack speakers that your dad bought, and they're about as big as you, and it's quite an immersive experience. It was an immersive experience to crank up my own to queue up secondhand news and rock it like that. So it was an interesting technical and varied songwriter experience growing up. But none of us were professionals. I should also say that even though there was tons of music in the house, nobody in the family did or knew anybody who did music professionally. So.
But the technical part of it and the medium itself, I mean, as I'm sure you know, of years of writing and recording songs, I mean, that's so important and it's so tied in. I mean, I think about you as a 4-year-old, which first of all, 4 years old, very young to be able to load a tape. I mean, that's pretty rad. But then also just physically standing there in front of the 2 speakers of a hi-fi, which would have been vibrating things, which would have been, pushing air towards you. It's just, that just strikes me as manifestly different than tossing a few AirPods in, you know?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it shook the floor, man. I mean,
Right.
it was like it was the big sound. And you know, I've chased that in our records, that experience, that moment of feeling like it's coming at you from all angles, but is unobtrusive and not annoying. You know, at the same time that you're completely surrounded by it.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
How do you make it not annoying? Like to be all immersive, like you're saying, but what are some techniques that you use to have it be that visceral and all-encompassing sound without being annoying?
With a voice like mine, you got to really work at it, man. I sing like a bird, so it's kind of it's annoying if it isn't you know, the distance from the microphone and the choice of microphone and then the preamp that you're using. Those were when we started making records in the mid '90s, or I started recording myself in the mid '90s. There was a lot of trial and error on that, on finding the right colors that would make it not obnoxious. and and of course, you're also listening to your own voice, which singers, at least when they start finding their voice initially, it's painful that you hate it. You know, you can't listen back. And then something clicks. Eventually, you find it's kind of about finding your unaffected voice, your you know, the true unpretentious vocal that you have inside you somewhere. And it's hard. It's hard to do. I think people who are in choir early on are better at that. Are better at finding it earlier on, but I wasn't, and I had to struggle. I struggled in my 20s to find my voice. I had always sung, but I was always singing along to AC/DC or Rush or the Indigo Girls or Ani DeFranco or you know, Prince, whose vocal acrobatics were just you know, incredible. But I didn't really have. I could mimic, but I couldn't find my own thing. And the process of making it not annoying on a record was one and the same with, as a technical process, also an emotional one. Like you find the filter that feels right to you to be honest in, which is a weird, almost sort of oxymoronic thing to say, because you would think that the filter would color it somehow, but really what the filter is just the mirror that doesn't distract you yourself. You know, so the microphone is the accurate view. In other words, you know, the choice.
It's funny, you mentioned people in choir being able to be comfortable with their voice earlier on, and I wonder if that's just because the process that you're describing there, in my experience, there's no way around how long it's going to take. At a certain point, it's just you have to spend a certain number of hours in the gym, and there's no real way to fast forward that.
Yeah, I played catch up with my voice because I had spent those 10,000 hours on guitar. You know,
oh, really?
I started playing guitar when I was 8 years old, and got very, very technical with it all through my teen years, learning, you know, how to play the entire Rush catalog and all of the AC/DC catalog and all the solos and little nuances and Metallica and these, you know, the 80s were a pretty good time for guitar music. For challenging. Yeah. And
were you just doing that by ear? Like you'd listen to the record and pause it?
All by ear. I can't read music at all. I even have a hard time reading tab, which is weird. I think it's because it's not a visual experience for me, except for the motion of it. But there is no form, static structure to music in my worldview. I feel like it moves. It moves. It doesn't sit still. And a piece of paper with dots on it is sitting still. So it's also antithetical to my experience of it in some way. That makes it very difficult for me to, if I have to look at tab, I can, but I cannot read music under any circumstances. So
it's funny. I feel the same way that you're talking about with tab and music as I do about poetry and songs. And so many people think that poetry is the same thing as lyrics. And I just disagree so much because lyrics happen in real time. They happen and they're not captured on a page. And it just strikes me as something very similar to what you just said there. Tab doesn't happen in real time. Music does.
Yeah, you're describing almost the leap from sort of simplistic, like basic arithmetic that you can write down and figure out with all of your, you know, carry the two and the remainder and all that stuff. You can do that on paper, but calculus is the order of our spheres. You know, it's like it's another. It can't be explained with regular math. You know, it's another dimension of things. And I think that that's when you put music to poetry, the music changes it and makes it some other thing that isn't just poetry to music. It's some other thing, you know?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Now, you mentioned a moment ago, you said, well, this is all the stuff that's going on at my house, but none of us were professionals. But of course, you would become a professional. So when did it start to look like you that music was going to be something different in your life than it was for, all the people around you growing up?
So all I ever did was music. When I went to a boys' college prep school that I commuted to near Queens in New York every day, or when I was working at my summer job at the fish market, or whatever I was doing, music was occupying every spare moment, and I couldn't wait to get home and save up to buy an amp and do this and that and the other thing. And that was a renewable energy source from the age of 8. This sort of obsession with the instrument, the guitar, and the tones and things. And so I had sort of inadvertently put more work into being a professional musician without knowing it than I had put into anything else. And I graduated from a 4-year Jesuit university with a degree in history and a minor in psych. And I worked lots of day jobs and cleaned pools and fixed printers and did all kinds of things. What the only consistent thread was that I was spending all of my spare time making music in some way, playing guitar in high school, beginning to write songs toward the end of high school, getting better at that through college. And then during my sort of job life after college, 1995, 96, 97, I was working on Long Island and in New York City fixing printers and working as a service manager for a VPN company in Times Square. And I still just worked on music. Like I had no shortage of energy for it. And in the end, the sum of that is that that's what you do better than anything else. So when I started performing after some catch up on the vocal, catching my vocal up to where my guitar was, still kind of isn't there, but I felt more comfortable doing that than anything else. It was loaded with all kinds of quirks because it was an unconventional. I wasn't trained. I didn't go to school. I didn't know anybody who performed or anything like that. I was just a watcher, and a mimic. So yeah,
it's a very American story. To be autodidactic like that and be able to come into like the music business and the music scene kind of fully formed, but formed in a way that other people kind of aren't formed because you're, you've maybe overdeveloped certain parts that people never do, and then you've underdeveloped certain parts that people always do. It's a very American story, it seems like to me.
Yeah. I came into the music industry green as hell on the politics of it. The relationships, the lawyers, the managers, the bidding wars and things. But I was packing a lot of shred. And,
yes, sir.
And it kind of helped. In the end, because on stage I didn't give a fuck what anybody thought. I knew I could do that,
I really hope that that's your bio on Twitter, packing a lot of shred. Now, to start that kind of initiation that you're talking about there, where the politics get involved, things besides just, the notes get involved, that would begin for you. You're playing the clubs in Manhattan in the late 90s, early 2000s. In my mind, there was a big music scene there at that time, based kind of around places like the Mercury Lounge, Arlene's Grocery. Bands like the Strokes would eventually get their break out of there. What did the music scene look like on the ground to you at the time?
Well, we were from Long Island, and we were transplants, and we never played any shows on Long Island. We only started playing in the city. In fact, the band that I was in college, we only played in the city and at my college in Pennsylvania. So it was, and there was a couple of other bands that I was in. Most notably, in late 95, early 96, I joined a band called Hope Factory, and we got lucky and toured with Joan Jett up and down the East Coast when I was 22 years old. And that was a lot of hard good experience that I would have stumbled on later with Wheatus had I not gone through it. And she was really nice to us. And
like, what were some things that you learned then that you were glad you didn't have to learn later?
You are going to be in front of people who do not like you. At some point, you will be in front of a vast majority of people who do not like you. In fact, you might even be in front of an audience who is entirely made up of hostile. They're waiting for somebody else to come on. Mm-hmm. And if they don't like your music, you have to still be generous because the privilege is still intact. You are on stage. You might not be, they might hate your guts, but you are up there. And you never have the right to chunk it. You never have the right to be hostile and phone it in or any of that. So those were early, good, hard lessons. And I don't think any musician ever is capable of holding that down 100% of the time, because there are dark times on stage and on tour that just overwhelm you. But the importance of that was delivered to me in that experience in '96 with Joan. And I wasn't in her band. I was opening for her, direct support. And they were. It wasn't always the case, but the headlining act were very good to us. She was quite patient and accommodating, and we were green as it gets, So it was a really valuable. It was like a crash course, like Cliff Notes and SAT tutelage, and it was all that I had missed along the way on the politics and the attitude. Yeah.
That attitude and that ethos that you're describing there of where possible, always being grateful for the privilege of playing music, even if, in practice you don't always get it right because we're all human beings. That ethos, where did that come from in your character?
Well, I spent more time dreaming about being a musician than being one. Mm-hmm. And I remember being, 10, 11 years old, dressing up as Angus Young for Halloween and thinking, like, man, if there's any version of this, because I wasn't staring at any kind of life like that. I was looking at something else. I didn't really know what I was looking at, but I thought if there's any iteration of this that I can actually cling to and employ, I have to take it. I have to take it on any level, And so I still kind of have, and that burned in real hard for the first 2 decades of my life. And I didn't really imagine success as a thing. I imagined just the smallest, if I could only, very small aspirations when it comes to music, because music is a breeding ground for megalomania, as you might know. And I had these teeny tiny little, I had mini mania, So I when it happened and when things began to happen, and all these years later, now that the parts of what we have done have burned in the way that they have, I find it hard to. It's almost impossible for me to take it for granted. Really, it always felt fleeting, and it still does. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of like approaching it from that point of view, I guess. The scarcity angle, if you will.
At what point did you guys go from being some interlopers from Long Island playing the Mercury Lounge in Manhattan to a band that is now signed by a label and going to get a chance to make a record and get a shot, got your ticket to the dance?
Well, so I had been in and out of a few bands, even at some time after or during the Hope Factory process. I was involved in another record that got signed to a big major label deal, and I got cut out of it and kind of robbed really bad. And I had been through a few of these moments and was feeling rather cynical, but not about music, just about knowing a lot of people. I felt like the more people who you had tried to weave your relationships into, the more people would eventually have their hand in your pocket. Right. And that wasn't really the right way to do it. So I started thinking about another approach, which was, well, what if you didn't know anybody in the scene, but you were good enough live, and the songs were good enough live, and your record that you were making by yourself was good enough that none of that mattered. That was my approach, because frankly, out of necessity, because I don't do political glad handing and keeping the relationship alive and Christmas cards. That's not my natural state. I have to stretch to do those things. So, but as discussed before, I didn't have to stretch to play guitar and perform. I didn't have to stretch to write. So I thought just put it into that instead. And so we were, just like you said, interlopers from Long Island who established very quickly a little scene between the Mercury Lounge and the Luna Lounge from 1990, late 96, 97, 98, 99. By the time 99 rolled around, we had lines around the block, people we didn't know. It had gone from friends and family to, kind of like, there's 400 people waiting outside who are not going to get in. And it was different. And it was mostly because people were talking about our song Teenage Dirtbag and a couple of the other tracks and the covers that we were doing, like Jesse's Girl and Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys and Surrender by Cheap Trick. We were doing some covers that were songwritery. Erasure's A Little Respect, which wound up on our first record, was one of those covers from the clubs. And those covers were, from different points on the map. And I think that confused people too, because believe it or not, it wasn't really popular to perform Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys in the Mercury Lounge in 1998.
Right.
It kind of wasn't. It was like, what? Like, confusing. And we were okay with confusing people. We felt like we could back it up live. We rehearsed so much. I mean, that's all we did. We didn't hustle demo tapes to people. We didn't put out flyers. We didn't do any of that. We rehearsed and made sure that there was a place to go for an after party. So it was a really small circle. It was like one party promoter who I'd known because of touring with Joan Jett, this kid named John Lennon, his father's name, no association.
Okay.
And he helped us make a party wherever we went and carry it on to another location. So there was always something going on after our show. And that greased the skids a little bit. But then it was also this performance that was happening. And I remember several times at the Mercury Lounge, we'd be done and the club would be like, you guys can keep playing, because it was just, it was full. And we were the last act on a Friday night or something, which was a strange time. It felt good and also felt like kind of rudderless, because we didn't get that from knowing people. We got that from doing stuff.
Getting better at your instrument is an essential part of being a songwriter. When you play better guitar, you write better songs. It's that simple. How do you do that, though? Sure, you could get lessons from the neighbor who majored in the pentatonic scale over at Andover, but that'll cost you like an arm and a leg. Or else you could pull up YouTube and pay nothing at all, but then you'll end up sifting through videos of nerds unironically weeping as they rip note-for-note Bella Fleck solos on a good time banjo they bought from Amazon Prime. What's the sweet spot in between? Peghead Nation, the online home for American roots music. They feature curated video workshops with world-class instructors on guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, upright bass, dobro, and ukulele. They have levels of instruction that meet the needs of both scrappy upstarts and grizzled veterans. And most importantly, all of it comes in at a low monthly subscription that actual strapped-for-cash songwriters can easily afford. To start taking classes yourself, head over to pegheadnation.com to check out their 50 available courses and enter the promo code TWS to get your first month free. You can also send a gift subscription to the songwriter in your life or to the player in your band who needs a not-so-subtle hint about their playing prowess. Peghead Nation, when you play better guitar, you write better songs. It's that simple. Hearing Brendan talk about how his band got started and how they obsessively focused on their music and their skill as musicians, or as he put it, packing the shred, is a great reminder of where power actually lies. In a world with mega corporations and massive unresponsive institutions, it can feel sometimes like there is nothing to be done at the individual human level. But of course that's an illusion. There was nothing that Columbia Records could have done to force a song to become a platinum hit. There was everything that Brendan could do with his band to create a song that was undeniable. And that's the difference between the machine and the individuals. And that's the difference between the machine and the individual human spirit. And there's a wonderful poem by D.H. Lawrence that touches on this. It's entitled The Triumph of the Machine. They talk of the triumph of the machine, but the machine will never triumph. Out of the thousands and thousands of centuries of man, the unrolling of ferns, white tongues of the acanthus lapping at the sun, for one sad century machines have triumphed, rolled us hither and thither, shaking the lark's nest till the eggs have broken, shaken the marshes till the geese have gone, and the wild swans flown away, singing the swan song at us. Hard, hard on the earth the machines are rolling, but through some hearts they will never roll. The lark nests in his heart, and the white swan swims in the marshes of his loins, and through the wide prairies of his breast a young bull herds his cows, lambs frisk among the daisies of his brain. And at last all these creatures that cannot die, driven back into the uttermost corners of the soul, will send up the wild cry of despair. The thrilling lark, in a wild despair, will trill down arrows from the sky. The swan will beat the waters in rage, white rage of an enraged swan. Even the lambs will stretch forth their necks like serpents, like snakes of hate, against the man in the machine. Even the shaking white poplar will dazzle like splinters of glass against him. And against this inward revolt of the native creatures of the soul, mechanical man, in triumph, seated upon the seat of his machine, will be powerless. For no engine can reach into the marshes and depths of a man. So, mechanical man in triumph, seated upon the seat of his machine, will be driven mad from within himself, and sightless, and on that day the machines will turn to run into one another. Traffic will tangle up in a long drawn-out crash of collision, and engines will rush at the solid houses. The edifice of our life will rock in the shock of the mad machine, and the house will come down. Then, far beyond the ruin, in the ultimate, remote places, the swan will lift up again his flattened, smitten head and look round, and rise, and on the great vaults of his wings will sweep round and up to greet the sun with a silky glitter of a new day, and the lark will follow trilling, angerless again, and the lambs will bite off the heads of the daisy for very friskiness. But over the middle of the earth will be the smoky ruin of iron, the triumph of the machine. I really wonder a lot. It's like you guys get signed around the turn of the century, and then when you go to make this first album, you're not heading into like some well-known studio with some old hand producer. You set up a studio in what I believe I've read was your mom's house on Long Island.
That's correct. Yeah.
And you make the damn thing in a studio that you've put together yourself. Like, I mean, my first question is, I have a lot of questions about it, but my first question is, how did you get them to let you do that? Was it because you had built this thing?
It was the short answer is because it was already done. Starting in '95, I was buying equipment where I could afford it. A lot like I would spend all of my fish market money when I was 13 on an amp. I was doing the same thing with my day jobs when I was 22, 23, 24. So I was accumulating studio gear. And the reason for that was that I didn't know how to describe the sound of our record to a producer. We could have had, my favorite record producer is Andy Wallace, and he could have walked in and I would have said to him something like, well, in the verses, it's like James Taylor and a little bit of hip hop, but mostly James Taylor. And in the choruses, it's kind of like Metallica and Dinosaur Jr. But the vocal is kind of like Rush or Ani DeFranco or something like that. He would have looked at me like I was a fucking idiot.
Right.
I mean, I had no way to describe these shapes to somebody and have them get it right. It would have been a real crapshoot. So I learned how to make those shapes myself with gear. And that took 4 years, buying and experimenting with studio gear from 95, 96, 97, 98. By the time 98 rolls around, my friend Phil Jimenez and I have accumulated enough multi-track gear to make a 48-track or 32-track rather record in a professional manner. And we knew what we were doing with compressors and preamps and EQs and things like that. So our demo had been the result of that process ongoing for those years. And that's what Sony heard. And a guy named Kevin Patrick literally took it out of our show on a Friday night, took it into the morning meeting at Columbia Records on a Monday morning, and played it for Donnie Ienner. And he said, go sign this. And he said, are you sure they want to produce their own record? And Donnie Ienner apparently said, it looks like they already have. So
wow,
we were done on that battle because we just did it before it came up.
I mean, are you able, you've been in the business for a long time now. Are you able to look back now and realize how unlikely
it's incredibly unlikely that we were signed with no music industry relationships at Columbia Records,
right,
with a deal where we were allowed to produce our own music in my mother's house without any interference. I mean, it's kind of unheard of. But I think that what made it possible was that like I said, we were so far down the road with it that it just nothing else made any sense. And they'll save money if they can. Right.
Right. Sure. Sure.
And that doesn't mean that you get it, mind you, but
right.
but the other reason was that I don't think they knew what to make of us. I think they heard something they liked and they couldn't pair it with the people, and they didn't think they needed to, because we're so sort of quirky. We're a New York sort of singer-songwriter heavy eclectic rock band. Like I would like to think like if Cheap Trick and the Talking Heads got together with like Slayer, that's the range of it for me. And with some LL Cool J and Public Enemy influence and some of the hip hop that I was exposed to in high school in the 80s. But I don't think they knew what to do with that, especially in the era of, everything was 3-piece pop punk bands when we started. Green Day and Blink-182 and all of the others were kind of raging away at rock radio, doing very well. So when we were this eclectic 4-piece, it kind of threw them for a loop. It caused other problems later, but the real reason I think they threw up their hands at us self-producing is because it was already done and they didn't really know what to make of it. They didn't know what else to say it needed,
I mean, basically your plan was, I'm not going to know anybody. I'm not going to play the game. I'm just going to make something so unassailably compelling that it basically forces the industry, it forces their hand, basically. Like they'd be idiots not to sign it. And so that was your plan, and it worked perfectly.
Yeah, well, it worked perfectly until we got into the party and everyone started looking around and thinking like, who the hell are they and how'd they get in here?
Right.
And that was post platinum records. That was after the record went into the places that we never thought it would go. It took a little while for that, right? Because my understanding is it didn't quite break in the States at first, and you had to go
abroad, was it Australia or UK where you first landed and people knew the song and knew it well?
Australia was first.
Okay.
After about 6 months of touring the States from the summer of 2000 through to Thanksgiving of 2000, we had run out of steam with the label and radio promotion in America, and it was a dead issue. No one was calling us back. And then I was home at the very tail end of the Thanksgiving holiday, recuperating from bronchitis that I had had from the tour bus for a month and a half or whatever. And I got a call from Kevin, who was our A&R guy, who was the one who brought the record to Columbia, and he said, "You're going to be #1 in Australia." And I thought, I don't really understand what that means, but AC/DC's from there. So,
right.
And then he said, "You have to go there." And I tried to talk him out of it. I was like, "I can't go to Australia. I'm still sick. I can't shake this cough. And, we're not sure about you guys telling us to go places because you haven't been calling us back for 4 months." And so,
Right.
And he was like, "No, you don't understand. It's going to be a Christmas single. You're going to be in a #1 pop chart hit there, and you have to go down and be on television and all this stuff." And I thought, okay, I'll go be on television. Fine.
Right.
But always like I was describing earlier, the scarcity, the skepticism was all really had dug itself in very deeply,
Sure.
So when we went down there, we did just that. We were on TV and we were on the radio, and it was the song you couldn't get away from. That's that summer for them, which is, seasons are flipped, and Christmas time down there is you're on the beach, which was totally weird for me. After spending 6 months in a nice cold tour bus and
right. Yeah.
Driving across Chicago and all of that. But the changed things profoundly right away. One of the things that happened was we turned in toward each other and started to feel a little vindicated because, whenever you're in as a band, they do try to do this divide and conquer thing. Can you tell your brother to lose more weight? Can you tell your guitar player to play a Gibson Les Paul and put on some leather pants, please? Because we can't service it to American rock radio if you don't do that. Like they try to get you to influence each other in the ways that'll get their job done easier, I guess. And at that point, we got down to Australia and we said, are you guys getting the feeling that nobody made this happen, that just the song did this, that it's actually been an orphan at the label the whole time, and they didn't know what to do with it, and they liked it, but they didn't know how to make it happen, and here it is happening. And we changed our attitude based on that kind of, I don't know if it would be called confidence because we were so green. It was more like cockiness.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, and it's interesting that instead of that hit down there making you, I'm sure on some level the label thought like, well, they'll be thankful to us that they have a hit now. And it's interesting that it engendered the opposite reaction. It made you go back and kind of question everything that they had been doing for you or not doing for you before.
Yeah. When you're younger and you see the Columbia Records logo that you saw on your Willie Nelson LPs, right?
Right.
And that's the same one that's on your record. And then you know that they have Barbra Streisand and Bruce Springsteen and Bob Dylan and Destiny's Child is on there and all these artists that you respect and admire, and then you kind of realize that it's like, well, maybe they're going through the same, maybe they're getting bad advice too, and it's a little bit of a harebrained mission in the first place because nobody who really knows what a hit is works at a label because they'd be making hits if they did, so it's kind of the edifice comes crashing down and you no longer look up to this thing. You begin to realize that it's all human interactions and mistakes and tumbles, and some people get lucky and claim credit and others blame everybody else, but it's like it was much easier for us to point to the song and say, we just do what Dirtbag tells us.
Right. So how did that affect your relationship going forward with them? Because then Teenage Dirtbag, goes platinum, becomes a global phenomenon. So obviously now you're going to get the opportunity to make another record. How did that affect your business relationship with the label at that point?
Well, it effective immediately. We got lucky with a guy named Blair McDonald in the UK. He got Teenage Dirtbag, and he knew what to do with it, and he had seen what happened in Australia, and he made it his personal mission to navigate the UK pop industry for the song, which I think that is a lot more of a, the BBC and Radio 1 are institutions that go back to, the 1920s, and it's very for lack of a better term, it's like a monarchy of industry there. So having somebody walk it through that system was beneficial and put it on the map for the long term, and that changed things immeasurably. At that point, I think that's probably when the Kids in One Direction heard it, for example. Like, it got into people's blood in a way that you don't see often. That's rare. That made it very, very different. And then in short order, we were touring without tour support, and we had done that earlier. But what I mean is that we were making money touring.
Ah, yes.
Right. So that peeled us away from the label agenda even more, because when they are paying you to go on the road, they can tell you where to be. And when you're making your own money, that's a little bit more of a tricky prospect. So if they want you at a television station at 6:30 in the morning on a Saturday, you have a little bit more leverage,
Right.
And some of the lunacy that we had been put through in the early touring on the label in America, the stuff that got us sick and tired and burnt out, was so that we were able to insulate ourselves from that. So that was a major quality of life change almost immediately. That's not to say it was easy, because right. But we had a little bit more control that way. And I think that we were different from the other bands. I think maybe we might have been the only act that came out that year that got themselves off tour support within the first quarter of the second quarter of their record being out. Huh. And that made things good and bad, because then there's this problem of people at the label, they like to take credit for something that's happening.
Right.
Well, nobody really knew us there except our A&R guy and a handful of art people in the New York office. Mm-hmm. So that was a bumpy road, having people come up to you who you never met saying, "Hey man, I hope you're glad I broke your record for you." That was weird. That we didn't like that. We couldn't get used to that. And better artists who know how to play the game, they can roll with that stuff,
Yes.
But I made that record in my mother's basement, and
right.
It's kind of stings a little bit when some clown comes up and he's like, "Hey, I did this," because that's just I don't know you. You weren't there. What are you talking about?
100%.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I want to just kind of zoom out a little bit and take kind of like the 10,000 foot look at this, because the more I've been thinking about Wheatus and this song a lot recently in the last couple months, and what seems very interesting to me is, in my estimation, and I listen to a lot of music, but in like the last 20 years, that song, you can put it next to, there's like a handful. It's like that, like Mr. Brightside, Someone Like You. There's like half a dozen songs that were not only like massive hits when they came out, but have remained massive hits for a couple decades across generations. Teenage Dirtbag is now being, covered by kids who were in diapers when it first came out, So I guess here's my question after that very long setup there. As an artist, how do you even begin to conceptualize what that song ended up becoming? Does it still feel like yours? Does it feel like something beyond that? Like, what is your personal relationship with it? I mean, it must be a strange thing.
The inception and the life that it lives now are not necessarily important to one another, because one of them is me alone, unknown, no friends in the industry, no band, lying on a futon, on a converted living room apartment floor, you know, where the dining room table used to be, paying $250 a month rent, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Cyndi Lauper, and plucking out this song that meant something to me, that honest about where I was in 1984 on Long Island, right? And that is nice, but it isn't important to people who find it now and write themselves into the narrative. The only thing that is really important about the song is the way people experience it for their own story, make their own character of it, see their own lives in this little 3-act play. And what my author's intentions, they're all kind of irrelevant at that point, because longevity isn't a measure of what I did. Longevity is a measure of how people process it now, today, you know, for themselves, not for me, for themselves. So, you know, the author is dead, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And I've talked about where the song came from and the environment of my youth and all that stuff, and it's important to me, and it's interesting sometimes in a true crime kind of way, but that does nothing to enhance or detract from somebody who's 14 years old, doesn't really know who they are, and is kind of singing it to themselves in the mirror, you know, the way that I was when I was writing it. You know, that's what they think of it is infinitely more important. So it's an interpretation always.
What does your creative practice look like now? Do you spend, time off the road or time that's not personal time? Are you spending that in a studio working on stuff? Like, what does your art life look like these days?
I live in New York City, and I've been lucky enough to set up a working space that I actually live in with all the analog gear that we've collected over the years, and a decent recording room for drums. And we make the records here in my home still. The 2020 version of Teenage Dirtbag was re-recorded here from scratch. And as far as my creative life now, it's kind of all over the place. I can sit in the backyard and kind of pluck away on some really strange chord that I don't know the name of until a transition comes to me, and then it makes sense, then it has a context. Those discovery moments are forever renewable for me on guitar. I always approach it like I don't know how to play, like it's my first day with the thing. And so, you know, I make all these weirdo, you know, noodly mistakes until something evolves. The best example of that in terms of like the modern creative life, in 2016, we put out a song called Lullaby. And I thought, a few years before that, the luthier jazz musician, Carl Thompson, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He makes the bass that Les Claypool plays.
Oh, okay.
Made some guitars for Lou Reed and such. And he's still working in Brooklyn, and he's this 80-year-old guy who plays the fretless bass. And he sat me down one day. We were talking about instruments because he was making us a pair of basses. And he sat me down and he said, you really don't know anything until you can play Somewhere Over the Rainbow in every key. and I said, what? Who can do that, Carl? And he sat down with his bass and he played and sang it to me in every key on the bass. And he was doing these transitions. It occurred to me that he knew the shape of that song in every possible iteration on his instrument. And I learned something about the song that 1,000 Wizard of Oz viewings can't teach you, is that it has a shape, right? And this shape was made from nothing. At some point, there was no shape, and then there was a shape. It's like the expansion theory, and
what's the expansion theory? I'm sorry.
It's like the Big Bang, like the universe kind of was birthed into a vacuum from a singularity. And I thought about that years later, 2016. I remember meditating on Carl playing that song. I thought, let me see if I can write a jazz standardy song that I can make into a metal, psychedelic, stoner rock heavy thing, and merge those two things that seem so disparate. And the song Lullaby came out of that process. and I wanted it to be short and concise. And it was this little sort of allegory about a lot of the baby boomers kind of falling into pharmaceutical addiction and that kind of thing, and how nice the neighborhood was when those people weren't addicted and so troubled. And I went down that road in this sort of somewhere over the rainbow motif, but I was trying to find chords I knew nothing about because I am not a jazz musician. So, like, for example, I was on this sort of like and I was finding those chords one note at a time. And my girlfriend, who is a jazz person, who does know how to sing jazz songs, is like, what the hell are you doing? She's walking through the kitchen, and I'm spending a month finding these like little moments on the guitar. And she's like, are you reading a chart? You know, these are all chartable. These are all on a chart somewhere. And I'm like, I'm finding them. I'm finding them by myself. Like, this is how I play guitar. This is how I learned how to play guitar. I'm teaching myself jazz from nothing, you know, like from zero, from knowing nothing about it. And that was the single most rewarding songwriter experience, because it was like, you admit at the top of it that you don't know how to do it.
Right.
And,
now,
you know,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
So that's the creative process, not knowing how to do it, entirely not knowing how to do it, and then doing it.
I love that idea of starting with, you know, kind of continuing with the beginner's mind, the same way that, you know, 8-year-old you would have picked up a guitar. Are there any things as a songwriter over the last 20 or 25 years, though, that are muscles that you have built up that you have improved at?
Oh, shit, yeah. I mean, I got AC/DC muscles that I'll never lose, you know.
Sure.
That A chord at the second fret, you know, you got to know how to rock that, and your plexi amp settings have to be right for that to really rock the bells, because no one ever did it better. So if you're going to have an A chord in your song, it better be AC/DC or get the fuck out, you know.
Right.
So there's a lot of meat and potatoes to it. The 10,000 hours are well and truly burned in. There's a bit of Alex Lifeson in there for me as well, and Geddy Lee, and being flexible with where the downbeat is another byproduct of not being professionally trained in music. A lot of the guys who come through here will say to me, like, yeah, I understand what you're doing, but I don't see where the one is on this count. How do you count it in? Mm-hmm. And I'll give them an unconventional count in, like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, da 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 da. You know, so I don't have a start point to speak of, and I think that has helped me keep it fresh for myself, you know, at least.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I've learned over the last 10 or 15 years is when I'm going most wrong creatively, it's when I'm super focused on process in a way that after I play something for somebody, I have to explain how like I arrived there. And when things are going best, it's when the only thing that matters, if you play a song, a demo, or maybe a mix that you just have, everything that needs to be said came through monitor left and monitor right. And you know what I mean? Like there's nothing, that's it.
I do.
And so what the reason I'm saying that is it sounds like your entire process on some level is just having like this monomaniacal focus on what's coming through monitor left and monitor right, figuratively speaking.
Yeah. Well, you're returning to a moment from when your brain started to understand music, when your brain started to comprehend moving air and the feelings that it can bring you. And you have that revelation moment sometime. I think maybe Bobby Darin, or I have stories from my parents, I don't remember exactly, but Mac the Knife, I was 2 years old and kind of singing it to myself in the mirror, kind of miming the Bobby Darin thing with a snapping finger, like watching my foot tap and all that stuff. And I didn't know how to play an instrument yet, but I was remaking the music that I had heard by myself because I missed it. You know, you have that immersive experience when you're a child, and then those neural paths are formed very easily. And I think that when you go away from the music and you start to long for it, if something sparks up and you're like, well, what if I just do it right now myself? What if I just make the music right now myself? I know how it goes. You know, that inception moment is, I don't know, I can't imagine shaking that. Like it's like breathing or something. It's like in there, it's really deep in there. And like you said, it defies a long-winded explanation. It's just monitor left and monitor right. It's just the mirror. It's just the stereo pair staring back at you. Yeah.
And this is why I never want to have to mix anything in Dolby Atmos. Well, listen, man.
Just say no to 7.2.
I appreciate your time so much. I've done, 150, 160 of these interviews with this podcast over the years. This conversation has been at the very, very tip top. I enjoyed it so much. Thank you.
Wow. Now I'm shy. Thank you.
Fair enough.
It's nice to talk to somebody who understands the gibberish coming, because I know it doesn't make sense sometimes. I'm painfully aware of it.
Made plenty of sense to me. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you down the line, I hope.
Oh, please keep in touch. Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Brendan. Bye.
Take care.
This week's show was brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. Use promo code TWS, the initials of our podcast, TWS, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. Wheatus's latest release is a 20th anniversary re-record of Teenage Dirtbag, available everywhere music is sold or streamed. If before we meet again, you sit down to write, please remember, an expensive drug habit is not a song, a compelling Instagram account is not a song, and most importantly, reverb is not a song. So let all that take care of itself, and for you, just keep your eye on the song.